monthly podcast on world democracy. I am Stephen Garvey, FDA Executive Director. Today I will interview Asad Izmi. Asad is an award-winning writer on international politics, specializing in the impact of U.S. and Canadian imperialism on the global South. He is International Affairs Correspondent for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Monitor, Canada's biggest left-wing magazine by circulation. Asad is author of more than 100 articles, 9 reports, 5 radio documentaries, and 2 books. His latest radio documentary, The Latin American Revolution, has been aired on 40 radio stations, reaching an audience of 33 million people in Canada, the U.S., and Europe. Asad has written 21 Progressive Canadian Union and non-governmental. Asad has written for 21 Progressive Canadian Unions and non-governmental organizations. The 3 editions of his groundbreaking report, Profiting from Repression, Canadian Investment in and Trade with Colombia, dated 2000, 2006, and 2012, respectively, constitute the most comprehensive and in-depth account on this subject. For Asad's publications, visit his website, www.asadizmi.ws. Welcome, Asad, to the FDA Monthly Podcast.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, this is quite an interesting subject, a quite unbelievable subject probably for most Canadians. I'm sure a majority of them are not aware of it, so I'm going to try and really flesh this out so Canadians can get up to speed on this important subject. So we're going to be focusing this interview solely on the mining aspect in Colombia pertaining to Canadian mining companies and the involvement of the Canadian federal government. I will begin with this question. Would you, Asad, please talk briefly about the Canadian mining companies active in Colombia right now?
There are more than 25 mining companies from Canada in Colombia, and they are the largest number of companies from any country in the world. So about 53% of the mining companies in Colombia are Canadian. As you know, the number keeps going up and down, because companies keep leaving and arriving and all that. As of the publication of this report, 26 Canadian mining companies are active in Colombia. So, anytime they can leave, anytime they can come in. So yes, it's a snapshot of what they're up to right now. And these constitute the majority of the mining companies in Colombia. The Canadian companies own the Grand Colombia Gold Corporation, which is a Canadian company, owns the biggest producing gold mines in Colombia. So they are the biggest gold producers there. So that's a very important position. Developing an open pit mine in the town of Marmato, which if they are able to develop, it will be the biggest open pit gold mine in Colombia. Canadian companies are very, very prominent in the mining field in Colombia. Other company that is very important in Colombian terms is Greystar. Greystar Mining, which has changed its name to Eco Oro Minerals. They are the second most prominent Canadian company over there. The plans of the Canadian companies in the mining sector are having a massive impact on Colombians in a very negative way.
What other Western countries are in Colombia from a mining standpoint?
Billiton, which is Australian, and there's Glencore, which is Swiss. Those are some of the other big Western mining companies.
In your report, again, I want to mention the title. This is Profiting from Repression, Canadian Investment in and Trade with Colombia. And this is the 3rd edition, 2012, updated report. You say in that report that Canadian mining companies in Colombia are complicit in genocide. What do you mean by the phrase complicit in genocide?
The complicit in genocide aspect of it, it refers not only to Canadian mining companies. You see, the report, I hope you have this clear, the report is about all Canadian investment in Colombia. And the other big aspect of Canadian investment is oil exploration and production in Colombia. So the companies that are accused of this are both in the oil sector and the mining sector. And let me tell you which companies are accused of this. And they are accused of not only genocide, it's the genocide of indigenous Colombians. They have also been linked to complicity in 8 murders, 1 attempted murder, to other significant military, paramilitary repression, to large-scale displacement, to environmental destruction on a massive scale, as well as to labor union busting, strike breaking, and worker exploitation. Right. These corporations are the 4 oil companies, Talisman, Gran Tierra, Pacific Rubiales, and Petro Minerales, and the 6 mining companies, Gran Colombia Gold Corporation, Ecoro Minerals, Cosigo Resources, B2 Gold, Midasco Capital, and Antioquia Gold. So let's take the first aspect of the genocide of indigenous Colombians. Companies are accused of that. Gran Tierra, which is an oil company, Cosigo Resources, Pacific Rubiales, which is again an oil company, not mining, and Gran Colombia Gold Corporation. Since you are only looking at mining...
No, but we can expand it to the oil as well.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. That's fine then. Okay. Yeah, because, if you just look at mining, it leaves out a considerable amount of the picture, because the Canadian companies are very big in oil development, I wouldn't say development, but oil exploitation as well. And the biggest private oil company in Colombia is Canadian, which is Pacific Rubiales.
Okay.
So often these Canadian oil companies, for some reason, are totally ignored, and just people always focus only on the mining.
Right.
Now, I don't know why that is, but they seem to have some, particular thing about mining. But, things are just as bad in the oil sector. So let's look at the first company in the oil sector, which is Gran Tierra. So Gran Tierra is accused of killing one of the major leaders of the Inga indigenous people in the department of Putumayo in Colombia. Putumayo is a big oil area in Colombia. Now, the moment these kinds of accusations are made, you have to keep in context what happens in Colombia on a regular basis. The accusation in context. We are talking about Colombia, where more than 70,000 people have been killed in the last 20 years in exactly these kinds of situations, where these companies from northern countries, from Canada and the United States and Europe, go into oil-rich and mineral-rich areas. And the moment they do, the death squads in Colombia, which have killed 70,000 people precisely for these economic-linked resources and economic-linked matters, the moment these companies go into an area, the death squads appear. And this is a recurrent pattern in Colombia that is well documented, beyond the shadow of a doubt. So the moment these companies go into an area, the death squads appear and drive any potential opposition to these corporate operations from that land, thereby making the land very cheap. So whoever is living in that area is usually killed or displaced. The value of the land then plummets, because wherever there's a killing, the land is worthless almost. And this is something testified to by the death squad leaders themselves, who work for the army and the security services and the government. So there's a clear alliance between these companies, the death squads and the government, to make it viable for these companies to grab as many resources as possible, whether it's gold or oil or whatever they want. And so where they go, the people are driven off the land becomes cheap, the company gets the land, the company gives a cut to the government and the death squads, and they're happy, and the people are killed and displaced. So that's the context for Colombia, socially, politically, economically, and has been so for the last 30 years. This has been going on. This is well documented.
How do you define genocide?
I'll just come to the definition of genocide in the Colombian context. Right? Dealing only with the indigenous people of Colombia, who are already their numbers are very low due to this kind of killing that the death squads have been doing. They've killed 70,000 people, more than that in the last 20 years. a lot of those people are indigenous people. See, because the indigenous people, they live in the areas where there's a lot of oil and a lot of gold and a lot of other minerals. They usually live in those areas, which are fairly remote. What happens is the definition of genocide is from the United Nations that I use. It's from Mr. Rodolfo Stephenhagen, who was the UN rapporteur for on the situation of human rights and fundamental freedoms of indigenous peoples. So Mr. Stephenhagen is the UN's authority on indigenous peoples, and this is what he said about Colombia. Many indigenous communities report selective killings of their leaders, spokespersons, and traditional authorities. Such killings appear to form part of a strategy to decapitate and confuse the indigenous communities, and they certainly hasten their social and cultural disintegration. These are truly acts of genocide and ethnocide against indigenous peoples. Definition of genocide from the United Nations, not from me.
Wiping out ethnic group.
No, you see, in the case of Colombia, because there's such few people left in many ethnic groups, suppose you kill the leadership. You kill 2 or 3 people at the top, or even 1. According to Mr. Stephenhagen, that is genocide, because you deprive the group of leadership. You, in his words, you decapitate the group. So when you're killing one person who is a major leader, you're not just killing one person, you're killing the group. You're decapitating the entire group. So now they will scatter. Because the leader has been killed, you know, it takes generations to develop viable leadership in any country or group or whatever. And then when you decapitate that person, the rest are terrified and they scatter sometimes into, you know, to the major cities. Or the group is very likely to break up, you know.
Yes.
So, and in several Colombian cases, there are only 50 people left in the group. In the case that I'm talking about, the Inga, who accused the Gran Tierra of killing their leader, there are only 35,000 Inga. That's it. That's the total number of people in the group. So, according to Mr. Stephenhagen's definition, the UN's definition, killing the leader of this group is genocide. Because it will take them a long time to develop that kind of leadership, and in the meantime, it's very likely they will scatter, they will be scared of being killed themselves, and their identity as a group is very likely that it could be wiped out. The indigenous groups, indigenous nations in Colombia are in a very vulnerable position. So killing their leader is, according to the UN, equivalent to genocide.
I want to shift now. What is the impact of the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, which came in effect as of August 15, 2011, on human rights and the environment in Colombia?
It's an open season on the Colombian people. Basically, the Canadian government is saying, hey, kill as many as you want, and we won't do a damn thing about it. We won't raise this issue in the UN. We won't pester you about human rights. We won't try to stop the death squads or anything like that. What matters to us, the Canadian government, is that our corporations make as much money as possible, and no matter how many people have to be killed for that, go ahead. So this means that human rights violations all over Colombia are going to go through the roof, and these corporations will have no worry about the Canadian government doing anything to stop them whatsoever. So it's a call for, it encourages the death squads to proliferate and kill as many peasants and indigenous people and Afro-Colombians and other Colombians who are seen to be getting in the way of corporate invasion of Colombia. The Canadian government has said, Stephen Harper has said, that this agreement is particularly aimed at investment, not just trade.
What's the difference before the free trade agreement between these countries?
Well, before it was not so blatant, because language is very important, right? The way you say things, the way your policy is structured is very important. So if you blatantly come out and say, we are going to have a free trade agreement with a government which runs death squads in its country and kills labor leaders all the time, kills Afro-Colombians, indigenous people, other Colombians, peasants, farmers, human rights defenders all the time, if you say that you are going to have a free trade agreement with a death squad government, then basically you're saying kill as many people as you want, and we're not going to pester you about that. We're not going to say anything about it as long as it benefits our corporations. It's an endorsement of genocide.
Right, I see. Okay.
Yeah. It's an endorsement of killing innocent Colombians, which the government has been doing for the last 30 years.
Also an acceleration because it would speed up the
Totally.
economic interaction between the countries.
Totally.
Yeah,
There's something like 40% of the land in Colombia has already been given over to mining companies. So this is just going to make it even worse. It's going to speed up that whole process of corporate domination and expropriation. So what the Canadian government is saying is that it's a free fire zone, the country, and you corporations here go and encourage the killing of anybody you want. We're not going to do anything about it. And there was even a time when they were negotiating this agreement, and just to tell you how blatant it is, that the Canadian government was saying to the Colombian government, okay, every time you kill a labor leader, you should pay a fine. You should pay a fine. I mean, they're not, they're not, I don't think they even fixed the amount of the fine. But they were just saying, it matters so little to us that you just pay some, piddly fine and everything will be okay. So they're basically legitimizing murder. So I mean, imagine if you killed somebody and you just had to pay a fine.
Yeah.
Wow. Would that be okay with the people you killed, or what kind of society would you be living in?
It's really unbelievable for most Westerners, I'm sure.
Well, for anybody, I mean, I don't think that in the West there is any higher moral standard. I don't think so. But the fact is that the Canadian government is encouraging the killing in Colombia instead of using its offices to eliminate it or to condemn it.
Exactly.
Which they can do, right? Which they can do, and they can say, okay, well, we're not going to invest in Colombia. That happened with South Africa. The whole world turned its back on South Africa, and look what happened. It really encouraged South Africa to change, right? But the more you get into bed with these kinds of governments and death squads and the corporations, then the more that kind of killing is encouraged. So when you say, oh, we just fine you, that basically means, oh, kill as much as you want as long as you pay some, silly fine for doing it. So it's encouraging the killing. Just saying that it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. You just, for public relations purposes, you just pay a fine, and I mean, it's really disgraceful.
Referring back to the report, on page 112, you quote Senator Robledo. He refers to the bartering between the Colombian and Canadian governments. Could you share some insight on what he was referring to there?
He's a senator, so he's speaking to the Senate, the Colombian Senate, and he says, as a result, in my view of things, and I will say it frankly, senators, it bothers me a lot that precisely at the same moment that the government needs this free trade agreement with Canada, not so much for economic reasons as for political reasons, given the absolution that the treaty signifies for the Uribe government in terms of human rights, three scandalous situations appear that benefit Canadian transnational companies. It is important to pay attention to this because, in my opinion, what is happening is that there is some bartering going on between the Canadian and Colombian governments. A few are going to get away with the silver and gold while absolving human rights and labor rights issues that should not be possible. I'm simply calling attention to this. So what he means here is that Canada and Colombia, in negotiating this free trade agreement, are bartering away human rights completely. Colombia and Canada are saying to each other, okay, we are going to open up Colombia to Canadian corporations. That is the favor that Colombia will do for Canada. In return, Canada will keep its mouth shut about human rights violations and the killings that go on in order to facilitate the entry of these corporations into different sectors. Canada will not make a fuss about all that, and we, the Colombians, will ensure that the Canadians get free passage into our different sectors and that they will be protected by the government against the public protests in those sectors, And of course, the government in Colombia is running these death squads. So a lot of people will get killed by these death squads to clear the way for these Canadian companies, which is exactly what's happening. So the bartering is that these companies and the Colombian government will be absolved of human rights concerns and given absolution in those terms, according to his words. And in return, Colombians will open up the mining sector and oil sector to Canadian companies and give them guarantees, economic guarantees and security guarantees that they will be protected.
In what other ways has the Canadian federal government aided Canadian mining companies and oil companies in Colombia?
Oh, very extensively. They have, in fact, changed the legislation in Colombia to facilitate the entry of these companies into both this oil and mining sectors, and they've done so in a very blatant manner. Even the royalty on mining companies, when they explore and find any gold, they used to have to pay royalties of up to 10%, and then when the Canadians got through with changing the legislation in Colombia for that, which is scandalous in itself, the companies only now have to pay 0.4% in royalties. So this is a blatant example of Canadian neo-colonialism, going into another country, changing their legislation, which will help their own companies go in and exploit the people and resources of that country as much as they want.
How did they get the legislations changed? Did they bribe politicians, or?
It is a kind of bribery. The whole thing is a kind of bribery. You see, that bribery is if you use bribery in a general way, it's saying to them, okay, if you want good relations with Canada and you don't want Canada to bring up these human rights issues, etc., then just give our companies access to your different sectors, and we'll keep quiet about the killings, which will be required to facilitate the entry of these companies into these sectors. We won't say anything about that because our corporations will be benefiting from that access. So that is a form of bribery. And that's why the Canadian government keeps quiet about these things. But, my report contains specific details on how this legislation was changed. That is a very scandalous and very neo-colonial process. And it shows Canada's very neo-colonial role in Colombia. Agency involved in this extensively is the Canadian International Development Agency. Through millions of dollars in grants, as I say in my report, CIDA has encouraged liberalization and privatization of the telecommunications, mining, oil and gas sectors. So it's actually 3 sectors, not 2. And these processes have led to the loss of Colombia's most valuable national resources and thousands of jobs. And by helping foment such social disaster, Canadian policy has significantly worsened the suffering of the Colombian people. Ottawa has created opportunities for Canadian companies in the above sectors by exacerbating the poverty and inequality that are the main causes of the civil war in Colombia. The Canadian government has done enormous damage in Colombia by opening up the country to its companies. In 1995, CIDA approved a grant of $4 million to contribute to the liberalization process of the telecommunications sector in Colombia. What's happening to the telecommunications sector is that the government ended up privatizing the big telecom company, Colombia Telecom, which was publicly owned, which provided jobs for 8,000 workers, and they privatized the company, and most of these workers lost their jobs, which is a massive blow to Colombians in an economy already which has very heavy unemployment and poverty to begin with.
How do you define neocolonialism?
Neocolonialism is the control of a country's economy mainly, and also the political and military control of a country, but without the dominant country actually sending troops, actually sending military forces. Mm-hmm. They devise the control of the country without sending forces. Of course, it's preferable. It's less expensive to do that. So that is the form of control that the United States and Canada have over Colombia. The United States is the major imperial power in Colombia. It's not Canada. Canada is not strong enough militarily or economically to really be a big imperial power anywhere in the world. The country, is economically and militarily not on the level of the United States at all. It's not even comparable by any measurement. But what they do is they go in after the U.S. goes into a country, and through the Pentagon and the CIA, they dominate the government and they take over the economy. Then the Canadians go into the different economic sectors where they specialized in oil and mining, and they take over those sectors as part of the neocolonization of that country mainly by the U.S. So then the Canadian role in the neocolonization is to exploit those sectors, oil and mining, to take them over and benefit from that, rather than allowing the Colombians to benefit from it. This is their role in neocolonialism. Okay. So when Canadian corporations are dominating a sector in a country, they are basically engaged in looting the resources. Those resources are not being shared with Colombians at all. The benefit from that, the Canadians are taking out of the country under protection of the American military umbrella and military domination. That's the neocolonial model in Colombia.
But also they're paying the Colombian government royalties.
No, hardly anything. As I told you, the royalties have gone down to 0.4% in mining. For instance, in Canada, they're 4 to 5%. At least, they're not even getting any royalties.
So what's the incentive for the Colombian government?
These are 0.4%, right? The formal. As I said, there's a lot of bribery going on. There's a lot of bartering going on. When the Canadian companies come into Colombia and other southern countries, the people in the government are employed by these companies. There's a revolving door between the companies and the government officials, right? So, for instance, the head of Gran Colombia Gold Corporation, which owns the biggest gold mines in Colombia, used to be Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Colombian government.
Okay.
Yeah, Araujo, her name is. Yeah, so this is how they benefit. They literally get paid by the mining companies. They literally get high-paying jobs and lots of money, and then they go back into, they go from government into the company. They're doing favors for the company, and the company does the favor for them by hiring them.
Okay.
So they make loads of money from that.
I want to refer back to your report. You mentioned Article 330 of the Colombian Constitution, which states free, prior, and informed consent of ethnic peoples is required when you're dealing with exploitation of minerals in their area. Has that had any value to the Colombian ethnics?
Not at all. There are lots of nice laws on Colombia's books in a formal sense, right? If you read their constitution, yes, you can't do this, you can't do that. But in practice, you can do anything you want. Who's going to stop you when there's a death squad? There are death squads killing any native groups or any native person who is opposing any oil development or mining development. They just send a death squad to kill them.
Right.
They can put any laws on the books. It doesn't even matter. That's just a law in formal terms. It's never followed.
Okay.
So in a country run by death squads, what is a law worth? It's worth nothing.
So there's no the justice side of it is
completely non-functional. Okay. Completely. The rate for impunity in Colombia, and that's why it's really that's why I put a lot of context into the report, because these things can't be read without context. So a very important part of the context is that the rate of impunity in Colombia for political crimes and for crimes like we are talking about is 98%. 98%. None of these death squads are punished for killing people. So it's clearly something that's done by the state. Their death squads are created by the state. They're sent by the state, and that's why they're never punished.
Yeah, and then you mentioned the fine if you kill a union person.
Yeah, and that's why they're just talking about a fine, you see. They're so blatant and blasé about it that they just come out and say it. And to give you an example from the oil sector, where the Inga people accuse the Gran Tierra company of killing their leader, whose name is Idalberto Imbachi Mutambachoy, they say that, and this is very significant, as I was saying before, that when these accusations are made, they are made by major indigenous organizations, major unions, that are very credible organizations in the Colombian communities, and that are very influential and very open. So when somebody makes an accusation, they are taking their life into their hands, because they're making the accusations against the government, against the death squad, against the Canadian companies, will open them up to the very big likelihood of being killed themselves. So nobody in Colombia is crazy enough to make an accusation like that without it being true. Often the killing is accompanied, preceded by death threats from the death squads themselves. And the death threats are sent by email. In the case of the Gran Colombia Gold Company, their 2 murders have taken place there and 1 attempted murder. So sticking to Colombia, somebody is going to get killed. The death squad very clearly sends a death threat through email. So that's a document. That's evidence that somebody has said they are going to kill you, right? So in the case of the Gran Colombia Gold Company, which is the biggest Canadian mining company over there, they're accused by the union, Sintra Mi Energetica, which is a very big union in Colombia, of 1 attempted murder. Unsuccessful, even though they wanted it to be successful, obviously. They accuse the Gran Colombia Gold Mining Company over there, the Canadian company, of being complicit in the murder of one of their leaders, Juan Jairo Zapata Marulanda. And he was assaulted and wounded with 3 gunshots by paid assassins on motorbikes. And they point out that Mr. Serafino Iacono, one of the executives of this company, Gran Colombia Gold, which also has the name Medoro Resources formerly, and they say that he referred to the mining labor force as a cluster of paramilitaries and guerrilla rebels, and said he was going to take care of the case in conjunction with the government. You see? Mm-hmm. That is clear evidence against Mr. Iacono that he is involved in the killing, because in Colombia, if you say this, if you call anybody a guerrilla, that is a death sentence on them, because the death squads are known to kill anyone accused of being guerrillas on the orders of the government. So that's known practice, right? So right. If you are the chief executive of a company and you accuse one of your workers of being a guerrilla, or all your workers of being guerrilla, as he's doing, then you're basically saying to the government, you should kill these workers. So that's clear evidence against you. And then, and he's the head of the company, the Canadian company. So there's clear evidence against him that he's involved in the killing of the attempted killing of this worker. And then the union press release goes on to say that the email sent by the death squads was sent to the union's president, Mr. Dario Rua, plus all members of the board of directors. They received death threats and were declared military objectives through an email. So this email is coming from the death squads. Reasons given were their opposition to the sale of the assets of Frontino gold mines to Medoro Resources, and the time frame given for them to leave the gold-rich area is 2 weeks. The issue of why these people are being threatened and killed is totally linked to Medoro Resources, the operations of that company, and the death squad is sending an email making that perfectly clear, that we're going to kill you because you are opposing the company's operations. See, that is clear evidence against the company.
Right.
That the company is involved in these things. Now, in many cases, there are also eyewitnesses to the killings, people who have seen these things take place. All that is evidence against the corporation, against the company, and against the government. The problem in Colombia is not availability of evidence. It's that if anyone comes forward with the evidence, they'll be killed by the death squad. Obviously, these people are killers. That's what they do. So if you've seen a killing or if you have proof, you'll be killed yourself if you come forward. There is no court process to put your evidence through.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Right.
The government is not going to institute a case against the company or against the death squads because the government is running the death squads. So why would they go after them?
Right.
You know?
How would you describe the political system in Colombia?
It's a complete death squad political system.
Is it like a totalitarian system? Is it authoritarian?
That's another issue that I deal with in the report.
Right.
The political system is completely full of connections to death squads and paramilitaries all over Colombia.
So is it fascist? Would you say it's fascist?
I would say it's fascist. Yes.
Yeah, extreme fascism.
I would say it's an extremely fascist system in which
Right.
if you are not, in favor of the companies, if you are in the way of them, if your land is in the way of their operations, you'll be killed or
Right.
you'll be displaced. Now, there is no recourse that you will have to the legal system. You cannot have it. The legal system will not allow you to get in there and sue any company or go after the death squads or anything. No evidence is available, but it will not be taken by the government. It will not be gathered by the government because the government itself is running the death squads. Why would they do that? So there'll be all the evidence available. There'll be nowhere to put it. There's no system to put it in. That's why you have 98% impunity. I mean, think about all the killings. There's lots of evidence in these more than 70,000 killings. But where are they going to put that evidence? Who's going to allow them to use it in a court? They'll be killed.
Unless you go to international court, eh?
Yes, you can go to an international court. That is true. That takes a lot of time and expense. Right, you have to pay for that, you have to go to The Hague or whatever. And the other thing is, in Canada, there is no way to sue these companies for complicity in these killings. The Canadian law does not allow that to happen. In contrast to U.S. law, in the U.S. you have something called the Alien Tort Claims Act, in which you can sue any company for human rights violations anywhere in the world. Any American company, any U.S. company. You can sue them for, say, killing people in Colombia or killing them in Sudan or wherever. Those cases actually take place in the U.S. So that's a warning to the American companies that don't get into trouble in this way or you can be sued for millions of dollars.
Right.
But in the Canadian courts, you can't do that.
Okay.
There is no Alien Tort Claims Act equivalent in Canada. So that's why these companies can get away with murder.
How does the Canadian federal government balance containing the conduct of Canadian mining and oil companies, for example, in Colombia, and allowing them to compete with other multinationals companies in Colombia? Balance that, because if they rein them in, they're making them less competitive, right?
Oh.
You see what I'm saying? That's what they would probably argue?
I don't really care what they argue. They don't have any credibility for me at all, really. I mean, they're complicit in a lot of killing in Colombia. But in terms of the competition of different companies in Colombia, that is not something that is a good thing. I mean, to be competing for the resources of a country which doesn't belong to you. Those resources belong to the Colombian people. So these corporations have no right to compete for them. First, the Colombian people need to be able to decide, okay, how should the resources be shared amongst the Colombian people? Because they really belong to them. These corporations, whether they're Canadian or French or American, they have no right to compete for anything. So I consider their position in Colombia to be illegitimate to begin with. If the Colombian people, through an truly democratic elected government, decide, okay, now we're going to keep, 70-80% of the resources for ourselves, and then we'll give 20% to the outside foreign corporations, then they can come in, and then they can compete all they want, because the Colombian people have made a sovereign decision to let them, right? But they have not at this point. So I don't see that as a legitimate issue, the competitive aspect.
Okay. To what extent has the Canadian media covered your report since you released it?
Well, we released it's published by the Canadian Union of Canadian Union of Postal Workers,
right?
CUPW. It's funded by them and it's released by them, and we released it in Ottawa on May 3rd. So we sent out the news release about the report on Canada Newswire, which is a very commercial newswire. It goes to all the corporations, it goes to all the media, etc. We never called the media up personally to come to the press conference or anything like that where we were releasing the report. We just sent out the news release. So we assume that they all got it. No media showed up on that day at the CUPW headquarters in Ottawa. We didn't get any media. This is not surprising because we know that the media are part of the capitalist system in Canada, and their interests, economic interests, they are just another corporation. And just like the mining companies are corporations, the oil companies are corporations, and they all have an interest in maintaining corporate dominance of both Canada and Colombia. So why would they cover a report that condemns precisely those aspects in Colombia? That would be bad for their corporate interests as much as it is for the mining and the oil companies. And so they would be the last ones to cover a report critical of Canadian capitalism in Colombia, since they are capitalists themselves.
What about CBC, which is a public corporation?
Well, it's only partly public. So, they get a lot of money from corporations. Television is full of advertising.
Yes.
Nothing but advertising on it. I stopped watching them more than 5 years ago partly because of that, and partly because they are justified the invasion of Iraq by the U.S. as a form of liberation, which was just totally disgusting. Yeah. So, they are very much part of the corporate media, just like CTV and all these people, all these corporations. So they would be the last ones to cover an anti-corporate, anti-capitalist report, which is, very detailed about the suffering of the Colombian people due to corporate domination and Canadian capitalism in Colombia. So no surprise there.
Has there been any reaction from the Canadian federal government about your report?
Oh, yes. There's very much reaction. To my surprise, I thought they would just ignore it. 2 hours after the report was released in Ottawa, the government called up the CUPW and ordered a copy. So they're very, very concerned about their operations in Colombia, and very concerned about what is being said about them in Canada. Apparently, that's what it looks like. And then, the next day, the report was brought up in Parliament by one of the Conservative members from BC who criticized the report for condemning the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. And he went on about how great free trade is and how come we don't like it and all that stuff. So certainly we got a certain amount of attention from the government, definitely, and very quickly. But
they basically refuted it.
No, they didn't refute anything. They didn't refute anything in the report. They just said that they like free trade and that they don't understand why we don't and why the whole world doesn't. Well, not the whole world, but the BC member got up to say that look what a great thing free trade is, and look how the CUPW is condemning it in the report, where it's quite obvious that free trade is a great thing. which is not obvious at all, of course.
But isn't that an unbelievable statement based on what you've researched? Killings and the relocations of communities, etc., etc.?
Well, yes, but, they don't care. They don't care about communities or anything like that. They are just concerned about how much money their companies are making. That's all that matters to them.
What does that say about them?
Oh, it shows them as completely immoral people, obviously. And as we know, Canada and Colombia are not that different. The same revolving door takes place over here. A lot of these politicians then later on go to work for these companies and get high salaries for the purpose, and the reason they're given these salaries and this employment is that they're defending the company's interests while they're in office. So that's how it works.
Interesting. Is there any similarity that you see with the Canadian federal government's fast-tracking of oil pipelines in Canada?
Oh, completely.
And what's going on in Colombia? Like, could you touch on that?
Completely, because, like I said, they are not that different. See, I don't have the attitude that, Canada is such a great democratic country and look at Colombia is such a basket case. Not at all. I think actually they're quite similar, both of the countries. And, many people idealize Canada and they say, Canada shouldn't be consorting with these death squads, etc. But actually, the two countries are not that different, and that is precisely why Canada is consorting with death squads, because Canada isn't actually that different from the position that Colombia is in. And I actually discussed that in the epilogue of the report. If you read the epilogue, it states exactly what we are discussing now, that Canada is not that different from Colombia. Both states are dominated by Washington, by the U.S., and foreign multinational corporations, with both economies being resource-based. And you're just talking about the oil pipeline. With both economies being resource-based and largely de-industrialized, and both political systems representing rather narrow sections of the population. I mean, there are elections in Colombia too. Of course, they're completely fraudulent. And there are elections in Canada, of course, but, they are increasingly fraudulent too. As we know, and the Harper government is widely accused of having won the election through fraud. So the major difference between Colombia and Canada is that, and let me just read the rest of this paragraph, that Canada does not have death squads killing thousands of people a year. But that is because it has a higher standard of living due to its more advantageous position within the U.S. imperialist system. In other words, Canada does not have death squads killing thousands of people a year because it has a higher standard of living due to its more advantageous position within the U.S. imperialist system. In other words, Canada does not have death squads because Colombia does. The death squads ensure the flow of cheap resources to the northern western countries, thereby allowing a greater redistribution of income than in Colombia, and obviating the need for extreme repression to control the population. Western democracies rest on a bedrock of genocide and plunder in southern countries committed by the former governments directly or through proxies. And this situation has prevailed for the last 500 years. Ever since the start of Western colonialism, this has been going on. You don't have death squads in Canada is because they have them in Colombia. Shows the money flows to Canada. And since there's more money here, they can afford to have a bigger middle class. And once they have a bigger middle class, and the money is, what the middle class signifies is they can afford to redistribute income more fully than in Colombia because they have more income. The reason they have more income is because they're exploiting Colombia and other southern countries like that.
I see.
So that's why they don't need death squads, because they have them in Colombia.
Interesting. I'm going to turn to probably the most important question today.
Sure.
What can Canadians or Westerners or non-Westerners do about the conduct of Canadian mining companies and other foreign companies? What can they do about the Canadian government and other government? The crux of this question is, all this information is great, there's a lot of evidence showing that this is going on, but, what can the average person do about it?
Yeah.
Right?
And I deal with that in the epilogue as well, and I point out that can Canada change its sub-imperialist status? Because Canada, to change Canada, we have to understand its position first. And it is a neo-colonialist country, no doubt about it, but it is also a colony itself of the United States. Canada, it's the biggest oil supplier to the U.S. Most of what Canada exports is raw materials, and a lot of it is exported to the U.S. So in an economic sense and in a political military sense, Canada is a colony of the U.S. itself. So, which makes it a sub-imperialist country rather than a completely imperialist country, which it doesn't have the power to do. So the question I ask is, can Canada change its sub-imperialist status? Can it change its neo-colonialist status, especially towards countries like Colombia? The fact is that in the last 10 years, 11 Latin American countries have broken out of U.S. domination. 11 of them, one after another. And if they can do this, then there is some possibility that Canada can as well. So Canada's breaking out of U.S. domination and Canada changing its neo-colonialist status towards countries like Colombia are both linked together. Canada's neo-colonialism is part of its being a U.S. colony. It's an extension of that. This is what has to be done within Canada for that to happen. Because the 11 left-wing governments in Latin America that have freed their people from U.S. domination, how did they do it? The key to their success has been broad-based mobilization of the population and the political participation of the poor majorities that had not taken before, that had not taken place before. So this requires strong social movements and well-organized progressive political parties that offer real alternatives to entrenched right-wing elites and to fail neoliberal policies. The Latin American people really wanted to change their societies, and they created the forces to do so. And it is now up to Canadians to do the same. So what we require in this country is strong social movements that are anti-imperialist. That includes strong labor unions, part of the social movement that are like that, and the participation of poor majorities that have not taken place before. So, 40% of Canadians don't vote. They don't vote at all. So the voting, only 60% of the people who can vote, or who are allowed to vote, do so, right? And those 40% are those people who completely do not see any of the interest being addressed by the political system, right? Many of them they have less money, they're poorer than the 60% who vote. So a key is getting the people not voting, many of them being poor, into the voting system. And this is part of the broad-based mobilization of the population. So it includes social movements that are strong, and it includes political parties that offer real alternatives to neoliberalism. Now, at the moment, we in Canada don't have either of these.
Small parties, fringe parties?
Those small parties don't even have a single seat in Parliament.
Right, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
You're looking overall.
Yeah, overall. So NDP is not very different from the Conservatives or the Liberals. I don't think they would do anything about Colombia or other southern countries where these companies are going on a rampage. Because if you look at the NDP policies when they were ruling provinces, you look at their policies. You look at Saskatchewan. They're not that different from the Conservative governments. They let the mining companies do whatever they want in Saskatchewan.
Look at BC.
Look at BC. I mean, they let them do whatever they want too. Wherever the NDP has ruled, they have not been very different from the Conservatives and the Liberals in terms of corporate policy. They're very similar policies they have. In Saskatchewan, they even let the companies do massive uranium mining to build the bomb, to provide the uranium for the American bombs. And they encourage that as well, So, I mean, how destructive can you get? So this is their record. So I don't think they will be very different when they come to power, which is a possibility. They might. One of the factors in Latin America, which is a bit different from Canada, is that the middle class in all these countries, in the 11 countries that I'm talking about, largely in most of them, the middle class collapsed. There was massive poverty due to neoliberalism in many of these countries, and the population reacted by going to the left. Now, that kind of massive poverty has not occurred in Canada, where the middle class has been reduced by about 1/3 during the last 20 years, but it hasn't collapsed completely. My feeling is that Canada will have to get a lot poorer before the left wing can emerge in a strong way, where it will be equivalent to what happened in Latin America. Neoliberalism did a lot more damage in Latin America before those countries went totally left. And the same thing will have to happen in Canada before it does as well. But I think that is around the corner, because we know the Canadian economy is very much dependent on the U.S. one and linked to the U.S. one, and the U.S. one is definitely going down the tubes. So the Canadian one will probably as well, and then you will probably see the kind of poverty in Canada that pushes the country to the left decisively, and which provides an alternative to neoliberalism. And with that, then you will have a change in their policy towards countries like Colombia as well.
Couldn't, with the U.S. Having its economic struggles, couldn't that redefine that country as well?
Yes, definitely.
So if the U.S. was redefined, wouldn't that redefine Canada as well?
Oh, totally, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. They're all linked, yeah. The whole thing is linked, because
Right.
it's an imperial structure that Canada's part of. It's not on its own,
Right.
They don't have these companies exploiting Colombians just on their own. They do it under the protection of the U.S. military. Certainly, the U.S. economic collapse is far more advanced than Canada's is at the moment, and they will have to go to the left in some way, or you would have a fascist dictatorship over there. One of the two. Certainly, the weakening hold of economic hold of the U.S. on Canada is going to help Canadians go to the left, definitely.
Thank you very much for listening in to this episode of the Foundation for Democratic Advancements podcast. For the FDA to continue to improve democratic processes worldwide, we rely upon your generous donations. Donate to the FDA, please visit our website at www.democracychange.org. To learn more about our mission, vision, and work, you can also visit us on Facebook and on Twitter.